We're getting closer to the cerebral cortex. Chapter 27 is the cerebrum. And this first part, we're going to talk about the diencephalon, which is a very important part of the brain. So it really just for this, like a lot of the systems we've studied, we're not going to get as in-depth as they get in the text. But I just want you to be able to list the basic functions, locations, and disorders, if there are any. There aren't disorders for all of them. Of the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and subthalamus, basically everything with the word thalamus in it. And to describe the composition and basic functions of subcortical white matter. So subcortical, under the cortex, white matter, it's axons taking information, right? So that almost gives you the answer just by its name. Isn't that nice? Very nice. So one of the things that I forgot to mention in chapter 26 is there is a really nifty chart with the different arteries and what area what areas they affect and what kind of symptoms might be associated with an infarction in that individual area. Great chart. And when we're talking about the cerebrum, that's a good chart to refer to in terms of disorders. So just bear that in mind. The diencephalon includes all structures with the term thalamus in their names. That makes it easy to know if something's. And the diencephalon is right in the middle of the brain, right in the middle. And just like the cerebral cortex, it has left and right halves. So we have a left and right thalamus and a left and right everything else. So the thalamus we talked about in the somatosensory system. It receives information from the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and all the sensory systems except the olfactory system, which has its own way into the brain. Other areas in the diencephalon are named for their locations relative to the thalamus, not by similarity of function. So like the hypothalamus is below the thalamus, they're all named by their proximity to the thalamus. So the thalamus is that little nugget right inside the middle of your brain. Cool, right? And in this picture, you can see it. It's dark in this picture. It's a diagram, obviously. So the thalamus has all these cool little nuclei that do all sorts of nifty things. They convey information from the sensory systems. That's what we talked about before. The thalamus is going to take information from the somatosensory system and relay it to the basal ganglia or the cerebellum or the cerebral cortex. And those are relay nuclei. We also have association nuclei, which process emotional information and some memory information, and they integrate different types of sensation. So the thalamus isn't just passing stuff on, it's also processing. It's doing a lot of processing. There are other thalamic nuclei, which are called non-specific nuclei, which help to regulate consciousness, arousal, and attention, and they're part of the reticular system, which we briefly talked about in the brainstem. So there's a lot more detail about the individual nuclei in the book. Skip right over that. Don't even read it. Unless, you have a lot of spare time and go nuts if you want to read it. Or, mark it for reading later. The hypothalamus is, strangely enough, just a little bit forward and below the thalamus. And its name means forward and below the thalamus. It's essential for individual and species survival because it integrates behaviors with visceral functions. So if you electrically stimulate the hypothalamic areas, you can cause an animal to search for and ingest food as long as the stimulation continues. So you can put an electrode in a little rat's brain in their little hypothalamus and make it eat and eat and eat, even if it's full. So you can also destroy the area associated with eating behaviors, and the animal will never eat, even when it's starving and the food is sitting right there. So the hypothalamus obviously has a big function in feeding, which is a very important part of survival, right? The functions besides including feeding, that the hypothalamus does include maintaining homeostasis. So remember when I said the hypothalamus is in the leaky part of the blood-brain barrier, and it's because it's directly sampling the blood to make sure our acid-base balance stays right and our oxygen balance stays right. It is involved in eating, reproductive, and defensive behaviors, emotional expressions of pleasure, rage, fear, and aversion, those pretty basic emotions. Regulation of circadian rhythms in concert with other brain regions like the epithalamus, and endocrine regulation of growth, metabolism, and reproductive organs. So these functions are carried out by hypothalamic regulation of pituitary gland secretion. So the pituitary gland is the master gland, secretes tons of hormones to control a lot of things in our body. The hypothalamus also has neural connections with the cortex via the thalamus, the limbic system, that's the emotion part, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. So the hypothalamus, right in the middle of the brain, it's pretty important. It's a really important little area there. The epithalamus is the major structure of the epithalamus is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is the part that is believed to help regulate circadian rhythms. And so it influences the secretions of pituitary, adrenal, parathyroid, and pancreatic islet cells, which are creating insulin and glucagon. So the epithalamus is that's the area, like if you can't sleep at night and you take melatonin, the pineal gland is what the melatonin acts on, if you want to think of it that way. So the epithalamus is sort of your circadian rhythm regulator, if you want to think about that. The subthalamus is in the diencephalon, under the thalamus, like its name says. It's above the substantia nigra, which is the area where the dopaminergic cells are located. And it's part of the basal ganglia circuit, which is involved in regulating movement. So it facilitates basal ganglia output nuclei. So the basal ganglia is like coordinating information, then it outputs that to the cerebral cortex. The subthalamus is part of that output. So you can imagine if you had subthalamus issues, you might have movement issues. The subcortical white matter is obviously, if it's white matter, it's myelinated axons. So subcortical white matter is below the cerebral cortex, if you want to think of it that way. So they're classified into three categories: projection, which means it's sending information somewhere else; commissural, which means it's coordinating between the two halves of the brain; and association, which means it's sharing information in the area, if you want to think of it that way. So you can almost think of it as like small, medium, and large. Okay, never mind. You can think of it however you want, but just know that it's myelinated axons that are coordinating communication in the brain. So very interesting. There's the when you cut that fiber bundle connecting the two hemispheres, which is made up of those commissural white matter streams, it's called a colostomy because it's the corpus callosus is the name of it. Sometimes in cases of intractable epilepsy, where they can't control excessive neuronal activity with medication or surgical damage of a single site, they will cut through the corpus callosum, and it stops the transmission of that excessive neuronal activity. And people can function like that. But there are some specialized tests that they use to assess vision and stereognosis, because obviously it changes things when the hemispheres are not communicating. But that is obviously in severe cases. There's definitely better medication out there now for epilepsy, so this is not a very common procedure these days. The basal ganglia we talked about with regard to motor function. There are also non-motor cognitive functions of the basal ganglia. So the motor functions we talked about, they sequence movements, they regulate muscle tone and muscle force, they select and inhibit specific motor synergies. And the non-motor part is they're involved in some cognitive functions. So maintaining sustained attention, ability to change behavior as task requirements change, and motivation. So when you work with people in the clinic who have basal ganglia dysfunction, Parkinson's is one of the more common basal ganglia dysfunctions. They have difficulty with sustained attention. They have difficulty, they have cognitive rigidity, difficulty changing their behavior as the task requirements change, and difficulty with motivation. So that is really challenging. That's a challenging combination, right? So that inability to maintain sustained attention, that's what causes, or this is hypothesized, they don't know exactly the mechanism by which it works, but that's what causes the festinating gait and the freezing of gait in Parkinson's, that inability to maintain sustained attention. So as soon as your attention is distracted off of walking, and it could be by a simple motor task like carrying a cup of coffee or somebody talking to you, or any kind of dual task requirements, it messes up your walking because you have that inability to sustain that attention. So the non-motor effects of the basal ganglia are very interesting. The cognitive functions are also that in the ability to change behavior as task requirements change. In the basal ganglia chapter of the book, they give the example of you're driving and the light is turning and you're deciding what's going on. And it's sort of the same thing, like you're walking and the walk light is on and you're crossing the street and all of a sudden a car screeches around the corner. Your ability to quickly change your behavior as the task requirements change. So you have to say, whoops, I'm not gonna go, I'm gonna stop. So quickly changing. And the basal ganglia are involved in that.